September 12, 1980. The sound of tanks rolling through the streets of Ankara and Istanbul signaled the end of democracy in Turkey. The military, led by General Kenan Evren, seized power. They promised to rescue the nation from the brink of a bloody civil war, from political chaos and daily violence. They imposed order through a new constitution, mass arrests, and widespread torture. For years, a shadow hung over the nation. And although Turkey has seen numerous coups and coup attempts, the 1981 stands out. Why? Because its impact can still be felt until this day. My name is Oliver Heute, and I'm excited to have you back here on Putschcast. And I will try to find out today, did the coup save Turkey, or did it fundamentally break its democracy? Welcome again to Putschcast, and I'm happy to welcome in the studio today my co-host, Dave Sloan. Hi, Dave.
Thanks for having me here, Oliver.
I've just talked a bit about the topic of today, which is Turkey in 1980. Now, what's your background there?
I have very little background on this topic. I happily describe myself as a curious Australian, but what I have read is fascinating. This is a thrilling sequence of events that took place in Turkey leading up to and following this particular coup. So really interested to learn a bit more about it from our guest.
And our guest is right next to me, Tezcan Gümüş, Dr Tezcan Gümüş. Hello.
Hello, nice to be here, guys. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to talking about this exciting period.
And you're a political scientist and analyst. You've focused your whole academic career on politics in Turkey, and the country's struggle with democracy and various versions of it. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. And I look at the question of why Turkey has failed to consolidate democracy across its 70 plus years of multi-party politics.
We'll touch back on that later on, your background, your studies, but also, your personal connection to the Turkish community. And by your name, we can tell you are of Turkish origin.
Yes, that's correct. And my dad came to Australia in 1973 as a 23-year-old young man, and then he met my mum in 1975 on a holiday back in Turkey, and they both came back, got married, and they were my mum joined him in 1976.
On Putschcast, every episode is dedicated to a sudden change of power, often unpredicted. We're going to find out if this one actually was unpredictable. But Tezcan, when we spoke leading up to this episode, you picked this particular event. You told me, Oliver, let's look into the coup from 1980. Why did you choose that event in Turkish history?
Because Turkey is, before that had two prior military interventions, so coups. 1980 was one which really had a critical impact on Turkish society, politics, and the economy. And we can still feel its reverberations today. And also it was highly documented too. So for a person that's looking into the 1980 coup, there's a lot of historical data, information that you can pick through that to bring it to life in any sort of current analysis. So it's a fascinating area. But also the 70s leading up to it is also a fascinating era to study as a political scientist and analyst. Not to have lived through as a Turk, I'm sure we'll get into that, but definitely the lead up to it and the event and post 1980 are fascinating for Turkey.
Yeah, and you just said Turkey, and I just want to acknowledge that I think both words are okay these days.
Both words are fine. I know that major outlets do use Turkiye, but I think the norm is still Turkey. I'm happy to use Turkey as we are speaking English. So
yeah.
Happy
to go with anything. David, just heard from you that you didn't have that much insight on the coup. What is your understanding of what led to the coup? What has your research told you?
The setting leading up to the coup, I guess, has been most fascinating to me. As I said, sort of grew up in Australia, so politics in this country relatively benign, if not boring, and the social and political nature of Australia as well is relatively homogenous, right? By comparison, the reading that I've done about Turkey during the 1970s leading up to 1980 is that it's a place where there is an awful lot going on. So politically, socially, religiously, and then you put that in the context of, I think, a world that's sort of struggling under the strain of the Cold War and all sorts of changes taking place. Turkey's sort of at the nexus of all that. It would be hard to consider that there wouldn't be, I guess, an event or a cataclysm of some sort. How this came about, though, is what I'm here to learn a bit more about.
Yeah, so economically, the 1970s were extremely turbulent. In short, it was a highly, highly dysfunctional, economically dysfunctional era for the average citizen. And that's why you see a lot of mass migration out, especially in the 60s and 70s to Europe, to Australia, to Canada. People like my family, my dad and my mum, who look to escape those conditions. If you're a working class person or a lower class person, your opportunities to better your life, stability, economic security was really not there.
I believe the vast diaspora that this created in Central Europe, Western Germany, Austria, Australia, Canada, like you said, that was factored in by the government later on as part of the GDP, wasn't it? Like all that money flowing back from Turks working abroad, that almost the government became addicted to that economically.
Yeah, I mean, you see a lot of developing countries that the revenue that is generated by diaspora overseas that is sent back is a massive thing, infusion of capital into the economy.
You've got this diaspora living in mainly Western countries, making good money. Back home, things are pretty tough.
Yes,
They're
yeah.
Obviously, at that time, you've got satellite television, you follow the events back home, you've got international newspapers as well. Politically, was Turkey at that time a democracy?
Yeah, I mean, in the very procedural sense, definitely. As I've argued, it was never a liberal or consolidated democracy, and politics is done in a very cordial manner. Yes, you've got both sides of politics, but yeah, it's not done where it's a zero-sum game, where if it wasn't in that sense, but in terms of there's voting, there was a parliament, active civil society. So Turkey had its first coup in 1960, and it had toppled the democratically elected government of Adnan Menderes and Celal Bayar, who had been in power for a decade, from 1950, the first election of the Turkish Republic, to 1960. But again, it transitioned to authoritarian rule, which the military stepped in to avert. I think maybe that's another topic for a podcast. But the 1961 constitution that came out of coup was one of the most liberal constitutions comparatively to other Western European countries. Highly liberal. Civil society autonomy, university independence, rights for workers, strong labor rights. So it fostered a very active civil society movement from 61 onwards, which the 1980 coup, military and also the right-wing governments of the 70s of Süleyman Demirel saw as a reason for the anarchy on the streets. They blamed the 1961 coup for giving too much liberal powers or autonomy and rights to people, to labor unions, to universities, to become very anarchist. So the 1961 coup was seen as the problem by the right-wing governments of the 1960s and 70s, and also the generals in the 1980s.
Putschcast. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram to find out about the latest coup coming your way.
It's a really good question to go reflect on. That was Turkey a democracy? Turkish society, even though surveys will show that the individual's understanding of democracy or democratic rights is not extremely deep, but one thing Turks do is believe in democracy in terms of process of voting. Following a political party or political leader is something that's infused in Turkish society and has been from 1950s onwards. So voter turnout is always really high in Turkey. In the current era, it does remain about 80% and above. And so it's non-compulsory, but Turks do love and believe in exercising their democratic right to vote.
So I've just learned the pendulum has swung very, very far. 1961, liberal, very progressive constitution.
Yes, yep.
To the event we're talking about today, where it went the other way around. History always shows that if a political system isn't backed up by economic success, if people can't feel it in their wallets, they therefore start distrusting that very system. Is that then what happened? Because you said the economic challenges were so vast that people probably started questioning the entire system underneath us.
Especially the left, definitely. I think left-leaning citizens, civil society organizations, and labor unions are obviously by nature, they're left-wing, start to really question the system. They felt that they weren't being represented in, I guess, the center of politics. They were being marginalized. And I think this is why the left became radicalized. In opposing that, right-wing militias were created in opposition to left-wing violence on the streets.
So it's the late 1970s. Turkey's a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
People enjoy voting. They believe in the system. Economically, it's not going very well. But then there's people at the center of that political system who are not doing themselves any favors. Who are those two men that are responsible for, or maybe are they responsible for what happened later?
Yeah, I think I definitely, in my dissertation and in my book, I do put the blame a lot on the political leaders. So on the left, you have Bülent Ecevit, who is a social democrat, comes to lead the Republican People's Party, so in the Turkish acronym CHP, in 1972 to 73. And on the right, you have a very wily character, similar in age, Süleyman Demirel, who is an engineer by training in the Democrat Party. What we see is the clash of these two very young men in their 40s, highly charismatic, both very populist, and both extremely popular of their sort of constituents.
They were not radicals, though. They were like in the what you consider a healthy political spectrum, or were they extremists on the far left and far right? Or were we just talking about, they were arguing about minor issues that really shouldn't have been at the fore of their political agenda?
No, they both believed in democracy. They both believed in voting and parliament, the power of parliament, but both just wanted to dominate outright. And for them, it was a zero-sum game, that if I win, I am going to destroy and annihilate you so you can never challenge me again. So this is how politics was done throughout 60s and 70s, especially in the 70s, between two men who were equally as popular as the other. So no one was outright popular in terms of electorally. So that's why when you see results, it's very similar. And this is why the governments that they cobbled together were never overwhelming majorities. They just refused to see the damage that they were doing to the country economically, socially, and politically because of this, cockfight.
Was there personal animosity between the two of them?
Extremely animosity between them. Yeah. Pretty much hatred, where Demirel would say when Bülent Ecevit was Prime Minister that I refuse to call the Prime Minister by name. And vice versa. And Ecevit will come out and say nasty things about Demirel, saying, he is a man that sponsors right-wing terrorism in this country.
There's so many parallels I can see to the 21st century and what's happening in Western countries nowadays. So we have a highly divided political sphere. It's Egos. Yeah. It's about power, which is what Putschcast is all about, and power changing hands. And we have a very, very fragile economic situation because none of this helps anyone on the streets.
No, there's no stability in government to impose stabilizing policies, economic policies. So there's, in my research, I found this information and it's very obvious, but there are policies that Ecevit in power, economic policies, planned to implement when his government was in power. And Demirel was completely against, again, opposing, trying to do everything to undermine the Ecevit's government. When Demirel came into power and he tried to impose the same economic policies, Ecevit would look to undermine those policies that he actually himself designed. So this is how absurd the politics was. And how can you create stability in a country when both sides are trying to undermine each other and do undermine each other successfully?
So their attitude to each other is contrarian.
Yes.
I think in some of your research, you point to there being departments within government that are partisan, basically. They're either leaning left or right, and they're kind of stacked that way, depending on who's in power at the time. And that, I guess, reinforces the division in the country and creates a lot of inefficiency in government itself.
What we know now is, even back then, when the left came into power, they'd purge or people who were known to or thought to have right-wing sympathies from the bureaucracy, from all government departments, and fill them with left. Right will do the same thing. Police force became politicized for that reason. The judiciary became politicized for that reason. So as you pointed out, everything was dysfunctional between left and right within it.
And no passion for compromise, which is so essential in a
No, compromise and consensus did not exist between these two sides, or these leaders. So how can their followers have compromise and consensus?
They are sitting on a powder keg because we have this combination of economic struggle, mass emigration, dysfunctional government. We're going to talk about the global context a little later on as well. But then there was also pure violence happening around people on a daily basis. And this led to some scholars describing the era leading up to the coup as a low-intensity civil war. Would you support that?
Yeah, I definitely have to agree. And not just through the research that I've read, but also when I was doing my PhD and I was living in Turkey for my field work for nearly a year. And the people I spoke to did definitely mention what a scary time it was for personal safety. These people that were late teenagers, young adults, going out at night meeting friends was extremely scary. There's one story I got told that certain bus routes were also divided into left, right. So if you're a supporter of the right and you happen to get on a bus route which is frequented by left-wing groups, you'd probably get either killed or seriously hurt by just getting on that bus. And you asked me, how would you know that you were affiliate of what group? Is there was also certain outfits that you wear, or the way you style as a male, style your mustache.
Oh, there was a political way of styling your mustache.
Yeah, I mean, if you have handlebar mustache in Turkey, it means you're saying that you are a right-wing supporter of the right wing, or you are a grey wolf. There is the left would have a certain other different style of sculpting their mustache as well to show that they're left wing, and they would wear more sort of those green army fatigues or a bit more red. So just to show that I'm a proud left socialist or communist supporter of communism. Yeah,
I'm more worried about the bus driver. I mean, he was just doing his job.
Yeah, I mean, so that's how bad it was. That's how dysfunctional and violent the streets of Turkey were. And you'd have regions where they were completely autonomous from state control, where they would mete out their own justice and have their own people's courts.
I just want to stress again that all this is happening in a functioning democracy.
Which is
the bizarre thing. Like, this is stories you hear from, failed states and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But it was close to it then. Or maybe that's what the military was envisioning, that we are getting close to becoming a failed state.
One of the things that you put forward is that a lot of the cause for division comes from leadership, which is kind of obvious, bottom up and top down, this division in society. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is. I mean, in also saying that is both leaders co-opted these groups.
Exacerbated.
Yeah, they co-opted these violent groups. I mean, Demirel would come out and say, and remember, this is the Cold War context, and Demirel for the right would blame these groups as being communist, anarchists, heathens, they're godless, and really co-opt right-wing groups. And this is known fact that to go out and attack left-wing politicians and also left-wing groups as well. Ecevit would do the same thing. He will co-opt large militant labor unions like DISK to undermine Demirel's rule. So they weren't just using parliamentary means. They were using means outside of parliament, violence, means to undermine the rule of the other.
Being a voter, being someone who believes in democracy, whenever this happens, usually there's a broad, silent middle class that doesn't want anything to do with either side. Was there a third way at that time, or did you really have to choose either of the sides?
No, you didn't have to choose, but you became a spectator to this violence.
And caught up in it. By taking the bus.
By taking the bus, trying to survive, navigate these neighborhoods that are run by, non-state actors, violent non-state actors, trying to line up, wait for petrol. Like you said, the majority of people didn't get involved but they couldn't get a way out.
And people actually died. Like the numbers are quite horrendous.
Yeah, I mean, statistics are from 76 to 1980, 5,000 people died in total from political violence, over 20 a week on average. These are from students, university, high school students being killed, to politicians, union activists, civil society members, radicals on both sides. I mean, even a former prime minister was assassinated by a left group.
Today's podcast episode is brought to you by Motorcycle Rental Melbourne, your ticket to an amazing adventure on two wheels across Australia. Motorcycle Rental Melbourne is your gateway for the most spectacular way to explore the fifth continent. Visit motorcyclerentalmelbourne.com.au to check out the fleet. Don't forget to mention Putschcast for a 10% discount on your next rental. Terms and conditions apply.
You're listening to Putschcast. In the studio today, Dr Tezcan Gümüş and David Sloan. We're talking about the 1980 military coup. We've just learned how difficult it was to live in Turkey in the late 70s. There was daily killings, usually politically motivated. The economy was in dire straits. The military, that plays the crucial role here. Turkey was an early NATO member. I also heard that Turkey had the second biggest army in NATO, so we're talking a massive force, I would say. And also you said there was mandatory military service that I think your father served in as well. So was it a military state? What role, what size did the army have in society leading up to the coup?
I mean, the Turkish military historically has always had an important position in Turkish politics and in society. And this stems from the Ottoman era, and the role that the military played in the establishment of the Turkish Republic. And you have to remember, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was a military man, and so were all his inner circle that set up the Turkish Republic. You've got that naturally in the DNA. The military is never under civilian control as an institution. It's always autonomous.
The state in the state, is it?
Not a state in the state, but it's an institution that believes it's a guardian of secularism, Atatürk's principles or founding principles of the Republic, and it was never institutionally control of civilian politicians. It was never a state within a state. It was more of an autonomous institution, if we can sort of look at it that way. Because a state within the state sounds like it's, let's say, when we look at Lebanon, Hezbollah. I mean, it was never. I mean, that's when we call a state within a state. It was never that. And seeing yourself as a guardian of the state.
Well, I have to say, after what you've just told me, I'm not quite surprised given how politicians behaved at the time and how little they cared for the well-being of the nation. Those professional soldiers that did nothing else in their life, there's one man at the center of today's story, General Kenan Evren.
Yes.
He will play a major role. Let's talk about him. What do we know about his biography? Was he one of those people you've just described? So he's never seen anything else?
To reach high rank in Turkish military, you have to have come from within the military. He climbs the ranks. He knows English. So, he's very well regarded in that sense internationally amongst NATO allies, especially the US.
Did he have a big profile in society leading up to the coup? Did people know his name and who he was? Was he a well-known figure?
Yeah, he was. And especially the more and more the later in the years went by, late 70s onwards, and the more the military were distressed as what was happening in society and also distressed at what was not happening in politics in terms of, trying to stop this or making a concerted effort to stop the violence.
I think the question I have about Kenan Evren is, was he the man in the military who happened to be at the top of the tree at the time that this coup took place? Or as an individual, is he a significant facilitator here? Like, is he the person that we should be looking at as the man who made this happen?
Yeah, he was definitely the leader. This was not, there's rumblings in the middle ranks. Before anything happens, I better jump in front and control this. A year up to the coup, he gathered him and the top generals, so the leaders of the Army, Navy, Air Force, in highly secret meetings saying, we need to do something about this. Let's start planning. This really started to crystallize a year before. They actually planned to undertake the coup in July 1980, and certain things didn't eventuate, so this is why it was held till September. But this was a long time in the planning phase, and he was definitely the lead, coalescing and really pushing the key generals in down this path, which they were all on board. Don't get me wrong; it wasn't like he was forcing anyone down. But to answer your question, definitely he was the leader of this from the very start.
I think that's one of the really interesting points here about how this coup unfolded is the amount of warning that the politicians were given that this was coming. And this date sticks out at me from one of the pieces that you wrote, which is the 6th of September 1979, happens to be the day I was born, was a point where the military declared their intentions to the leaders. They said, this is going to happen if you're not going to change your path.
Yeah.
The leaders ignored that.
Yep.
Why?
Again, self-interest. Ultimately, they did not see each other as the problem, themselves as the problem. They saw the other side as a problem. It shows a lack of self-reflection and self-awareness.
Particularly in a country where this has happened twice before in the last 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, in 1960 coup, the Prime Minister, Adnan Menderes, was hung by the military, along with 2 of his cabinet members. And it's still a sore point and a scar on Turkish political psyche and society as well.
With that history, I would have taken the letters a bit more seriously in the warning signs.
So Ecevit, later on in interviews, he said that, in hindsight, everything had gotten so out of hand that I wasn't surprised. But Demirel was unapologetic. Like later interviews, you look at it and go, this has happened under your rule. He was the Prime Minister in 1970 when the second coup happened. Again, dysfunction under his rule. And then it happened in 1980, and this man still was unapologetic and unreflective that he had any real part to play in this situation. And mind you, Demirel was also the president of the Republic when the soft coup happened in 1997.
I love how you have different levels of coups in Turkey. So there's soft coups, there's mediocre ones, and then there's ones where the prime minister gets hung.
Yeah, and soft coup is also called a postmodern coup as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the two names that sort of Turkish political.
You actually have names for that. Oh, I just made that up.
Yeah,
you actually have
soft coup and postmodern coup. Yeah,
it
wasn't direct. Level. It wasn't direct intervention, but it was a strongly worded letter and list of things that the Islamist government had to do, and the threat of military intervention. They stepped down from power.
I've got one more question before we go through the actual events of the coup, the putsch, and that is, in most of 20th century history, whenever you look at the overthrow of governments and the military being involved, it is very, very likely that the military sides with the right-wing part of politics. I've hardly ever heard of a left wing, except for, Khmer Rouge and a few other odd ones. But in general, it's usually conservative right-wing factions that they align with. Why didn't the military just go with the Süleyman Demirel camp?
Because they saw him as equally part of the problem. I think when you look at, the strongly worded letters, private conversations between the General Kenan Evren and Demirel and Ecevit behind closed doors and public, and obviously the military at that stage took a very objective view and saying both sides undertaking this violence equally. We can probably get into why eventually, subsequently, the left as a political movement and as a civil society movement was completely, destroyed to a point where they've never been able to recover in Turkey since then, and why the right wing is stronger than ever. We can definitely get into those reasons. But initially, at the time of the coup, both sides were contained equally.
Putschcast, a global podcast about riots, rebellions, revolutions, and the intoxication of power.
The big day is here. 12th of September, 1980. People wake up to the usual Turkish chaos of politics, potential kidnappings, and empty pay packets. And history is about to change. Now, walk us through what happened.
Outside the key generals, no one was allowed to know about this. Everyone apparently warned these generals, you are not to tell your partners about this, just in case it leaks. On the 11th, that's when they let the rest of the military and the officer corps know about what was going to happen in the morning of the 12th, so 3 a.m. They took over key buildings, they took over the state broadcaster, TRT, took over key buildings and announced martial law, dissolved civilian politics.
Would it have been unusual for people to see tanks roll down the streets and show up outside of government buildings? Or was that a usual sight?
No. It would have been completely, if you're in Ankara, if you're a civil servant and you saw tanks roll up, given the country's history, you would know something's happening. And given the prior leading months and years where you've got these strongly worded statements by the military and also letters sent to the politicians to do something about the conditions and the situation in country, then you would know something definitely is up and most likely a coup. So yeah,
the act of dissolving parliament. Is this just a matter of taking over the building and not letting people come to work?
What they did was they physically also went to the homes of the leaders, took them and their wives in to a secure location, and just sort of physically removed them from everything. So they can't make statements, they can't sort of talk to media to rile up their supporter base. So they did this very quickly. I think they really pinpointed who they were going to physically contain when the coup was announced, so they weren't able to, basically rile up supporters in society and really make it, a fight on the streets.
So it sounds like a textbook coup to me. Well executed, or was there any resistance, violence, protests on the streets?
No. So just to give you an anecdote, my mum's cousin, who was a young naval officer at the time, was asked to go onto the streets, to obviously for the
supporting the coup.
To support the coup, and he said they expected strong resistance because I guess you would, because you see in the 1970s these armed battles between and society's heavily
people
armed.
have guns, correct,
So that's what they expected, but he goes, it was eerily quiet, and they did not get any sort of violence or opposition against them. Now, and also very quickly, the military junta banned any types of protests on the streets. That were completely banned. Certain newspapers, especially left-leaning ones, were closed down. And also criticism of the coup was banned as well eventually in media. So you could not write any critical piece about Kenan Evren at all as an individual or the coup itself or the military. So that became like law.
Was it a sigh of relief?
Yes, yeah. I mean, every average person you speak at that time, this is the people that you're talking about, that middle, that average day person that's not involved in these violence.
The quiet majority.
They might have sympathies towards the left or right or vote for Demirel or Ecevit, but that's as far as it goes. They're a peaceful democratic citizen was extremely relieved that this violence had stopped.
In the 8 months since the military takeover, everyday life in Ankara has returned to a normality many people had almost forgotten. Even the inflation rates dropped. According to most people we've talked to, accusations about human rights and prisons are merely irrelevant attacks on national pride. We've been told that Europeans who call for a prompt return to democracy don't understand the way Turks feel about their bickering politicians.
Tezcan, we have learned about the day, perfectly planned, well executed, no resistance on the streets. The military was united as well, which is always guaranteed. It was textbook and a success from the military point of view, because one question we always ask on Putschcast, was it a bloody or a peaceful coup? This one was a peaceful one, but only until arrests started to happen.
Yes, yeah. So this is where societal views and support for the coup began to change when they realized the mass arrests, systemic torture that was happening, death penalties. So 250 people were given the death penalty, 50 were undertaken. There's debates around this, but the youngest being 17 at the time.
I was wondering, do we know what people got the death penalty for?
Yeah, it was because of those violent activities, political violence that they were involved in, or murders. So this 17-year-old...
So not for opposing the military rule, but for previous
it was
crimes.
all previous. Yeah. It was from the left, right groups, predominantly union activists and so forth that was seen to instigate this violence.
The judiciary was highly politicized as well, you said before. Were those kangaroo courts?
Well, they were military courts.
Courts.
All these sentencing happened and these hearings here. And if you watch archival footage on YouTube, I think BBC and things like that have little stories from back then, and you'll see like there were just mass hearings.
Martial law courts in Turkey are now processing thousands of cases in a series of mass trials. Here at Martial Law Court number 1 at the military headquarters near Ankara, 34 members of the banned National Salvation Party are facing charges that they violated Turkey's strict laws about secularism, insulted the memory of Ataturk, and tried to set up an Islamic State.
So you would have, big groups of people from a union, tens or maybe hundreds in a massive court hall in front of a military court. It's not a fair judicial process. That's happening en masse.
Kenan Evren, you just lost me. I had some sympathy for this man up until now from hearing about the history, where they came from. He, was an appointed savior of the secular society, democracy, unbloody coup on the day. However, then doing this. Why did he do this? This makes no sense. Why not try to win the population over? Why put hundreds of people on trial and not try to ease into a new phase that they were craving and portray himself as someone who's truly the defender of democracy, and that's not someone who in 1980 orders the execution of 250 people?
He's not the only actor. So there's many generals, many officers. So he wasn't involved in the day-to-day running of the coup or the junta.
Was he mainly the figurehead? Or?
He was the leader. So there's a lot of blame to go there. Of course, he is the leader, so he knew what was going on. But, we have to have a more of a nuanced view as well. There's other people in the military that were permitting this to happen as well.
Another way to phrase my question is, did the military actually have a vision or a long-term strategy?
Yes. The key reason was to depoliticize society, because they believed that the 1961 Constitution allowed politicization of the society along with the politicians and so forth. So the key thing for them was to create a depoliticized society. How do you do that? Well, we have to teach people a lesson that if you get involved in politics, this is what's going to happen. I think over 200,000 people were arrested and incarcerated. How do you also do that is change the Constitution. So the Constitution completely changed from what it was, from 61. And 1970, coup in 70-71, there were amendments made to the Constitution, but definitely it wasn't an overwhelming rewriting of the 61 Constitution. It was still there. It was just things were amended. 1980 was a complete rewriting of the Constitution, which aimed to depoliticize society, remove autonomy of universities, strip the powers of unions, strip the powers of civil society, political party. Basically, the political party's law created a structure of political party where it was more authoritarian, more centralized rule rather than decentralization of a political party. The political party has to be centralized. That means the state can easily control that political party.
To rephrase, the strategy of the military was to undo the 1961 Constitution. To do this impactfully, sustainably. So for many years to come, the military will always have an option to crack down as soon as things get out of hand.
They constituted themselves as the guardians of the state. And how did they do that? They created this organization or institution called the National Security Council, which during the junta period was run by the 5 generals who basically ran the country in those 2-3 years before the return of democracy. They ruled by decree. They made all the decisions amongst themselves.
So this 1982 constitution allowed for democracy re-emerging in Turkey.
Yes.
And that constitution's still in place. However, the military have given themselves the ultimate authority, and that remains as well.
Yes. No. I mean, things have changed since the AKP era. Definitely the power of the military over the tutelage of the military over civilian politics has completely been erased. In subsequent years, in modern sort of 2000 onwards, it definitely, the AKP undertook a very strong concerted effort to remove the dominance of the military in politics.
I did notice that in 2014, Kenan Evren was convicted of obstruction of democracy, and as a 90-something-year-old was sentenced to prison.
Yeah.
Why did that come about?
I think it was just a very populist politics by Erdogan. Could have been undertaken when they first came into power in early 2000s, but they held off doing it, and they just waited till he was a frail old man. So it was, yes, he was convicted, but he never served. He would never serve time for those crimes and those acts. So it was more of a hollow gesture, really.
The timing seemed peculiar.
Putschcast. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram to find out about the latest coup coming your way.
1980, we've got a well-executed coup. Bodies are put into place on behest of the military, develop this new constitution.
Yep.
Constitution gets rolled out in 82. It puts the government, the state at the center, protecting them, ironically, from the people.
Yes, yeah.
Instead of doing the opposite. And at the end of the decade, Özal became the first democratically elected prime minister. Did the military succeed? Did the military make things better for the average Turkish person?
Turgut Özal was an economic czar during the coup period, and he had free reign. When parliament was dissolved, the politicians, the leaders of that time, Demirel Ecevit Erbakan, who was the Islamist leader, and Turkish, who was the right-wing head of the Nationalist Movement Party, were given 10-year bans from politics.
I was wondering what happened to all those characters.
So they were given 10-year bans. And then 1983 is when the first democratic elections were called. Kenan Evren and the generals decided that they were going to create 2 parties, which were state-friendly, one on the centre-right, one on the centre-left. So engineer these parties that would conduct politics gentlemanly and with the state in mind, and not go beyond the bounds that were set for them by the coup leaders. But Özal, being the economic czar, asked to create his own party, just surprisingly. But this is also when we're coming to global economic and a global context, is because he had good relations with the IMF, with the West capital, and the US. The US actually really pushed Evren to allow Özal to compete in these elections. So surprising to everyone, he trounced the other 2 competitor parties and came into power with an overwhelming majority in Parliament in 1983. He basically was a centre-right religious conservative party.
I was wondering where he's sitting there. So
because he was a very pious character as well.
They're engineering 2 parties, and then he's got sort of a wild card, supported by Washington, gets in, and actually wins outright.
Outright,
Özal takes power, surprisingly, with the Motherland Party, newly formed. Maybe people just wanted that third option, and duopoly is never great either. What then happened for the rest of the decade? How did Turkey develop under his rule?
We had moved back in 82 as I was a young, I guess, a toddler, so lived through that period. There was a lot of economic pain. When you transition the economy of the country, the structure of the economy, the philosophy of the economy so quickly with little real legislative guardrails. It really threw the economy into turbulence. The high inflation after a while, a lot of economic mismanagement, a lot of economic corruption. Turgut Özal normalized corruption in government. Özal was acting in a context where there was no strong opposition at all because they were banned from politics. And you've got the Constitution, which is basically put a straitjacket on society to be able to protest. And what he also did was, and the Constitution does, is gave powers to employees as opposed to workers. So it becomes a very skewed context in terms of against the worker, the average person, and pro big business.
He has this great reputation internationally, but then does the opposite at home and corrupts or institutionalized corruption.
Yeah.
Which is never good for any national economy.
Yeah.
It never is. Corruption. What state was Turkey in at the end of the decade?
I mean, torture was still going on. Books were banned. I think the misconception about Özal is he's seen as a liberalizing figure. I think what gets missed is we have to compartmentalize that liberalism in an economic, financial sense, not a liberal in a rights or democratic sense. Because he, even though he had overwhelming majority in parliament, he refused to maybe roll back a lot of the legislation which was left from the coup period. He refused to take it back. In 87, there's a referendum called. Evren actually pushes Özal to say, hey, look, the people are asking for these guys back. Take it to a referendum. And then Özal actually campaigns publicly campaigns to maintain these bans.
So Kenan Evren gets back in the good books with me now. So he does what he does best. He fights for democracy while using torture and executions. He's president at the time, throughout the 80s, and Özal is the prime minister, so doing all the daily work. And then they become opponents.
They don't become opponents in that sense, but I think, every historical figure is highly complex. And Evren definitely tells Özal, look, maybe take this to a referendum. If people choose to uphold the ban, hey, we maintain the ban on politicians. If they don't, then so be it. But you have to sort of maybe allow for this groundswell that's occurring to go through the process. Now, Özal, to show you how, that he wasn't the most democratic character, campaigned no to maintain these bans. But he was unsuccessful, and the referendum backed the removal of the bans of these politicians, and they re-entered. And that, from that point on, Özal really was not able to maintain his electoral power.
Democracy was phased back in.
Yes, yeah. Dysfunctional as it was.
Putschcast. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram to find out about the latest coup coming your way.
We had tumultuous years in the 1970s. A military coup followed. There was a new constitution drafted by the military. However, there was a referendum. There was popular support.
Yeah.
Economically, the country didn't recover as well as initially hoped.
Yes.
Corruption playing a big role in that in the late 1980s. What we haven't touched on is that Turkey isn't a homogenous country. Turkey's so complex. And also, I think just the urban metropolitan divide as well. You've got this metropolis that is Istanbul and ever-growing. Ankara, the political center. You don't hear much about Izmir or any other areas. Was there a divide in Turkey? Was there popular support, as we see in contemporary Turkish politics, from certain parts of the country versus the liberal metropolitan elites, for example?
Yeah, I think that one thing I forgot to mention is, the coup outlawed Kurdish language and Kurdish culture, and it really cracked down or repressed southeast and east, where it's Kurdish majority in Turkey. So that was very clear and unfortunate outcomes for Turkey and Turkish citizens, expressions of Kurdish culture. were outlawed. One of the things that we didn't get into, but not many people get into, is so the PKK formally was established in 1984,
which is the political wing of the Kurdish.
Yeah, Kurdish Workers' Party, which is the armed wing of the Kurdish political movement in Turkey. Before 1984, it had begun to sprout out in the southeast and east of the country. There were armed attacks against, military and police. The Kurdish armed movement, which is also Marxist as well, or very left-leaning. So they also wanted seeking autonomy from the state in those regions.
The Turkish military that staged the coup, was there any Kurdish representation in the military, or was it ethnically divided, that Kurds didn't have a chance to go through the ranks?
No. I mean, in Turkey, there is not this, you don't have an identity card that says, you're Kurdish or you're Turkish or whatever it is. There is no segregation of if you're Kurdish or Turkish and you have different sort of opportunities or less opportunities, you're a second-class citizen. It's when you express that Kurdish identity or Kurdish nationalism is when the state will crack down on you. And this has been the issue. The state does not allow for expressions of Kurdish identity, especially when it's politically motivated.
So the military coup led to a crackdown on any form that isn't Turkish nationalism.
Yes.
Oppressed minorities, because there's Armenians as well, and probably smaller minorities
anyone
in Turkey.
Yeah, because the constitution extolled the unitary of the state. And again, what is an attack on the unitary state is very loosely defined. So it was Islamism, it was Kurdish identity, it was Armenian identity. And it gives the state a lot of room to move and to target whoever it wants to target because of these constituted laws of any attacks on the unity of the state of the Turkish Republic can be prosecuted.
So the Cold War is going on at this time, right? The influence of that in particular, I think, with Turkey located where it is, directly south of Russia. How did that influence the feelings that Turkish people had at the time? And I talked before about, their ambition and the direction that they want to be heading in. Is there a side being taken?
So Turkey was always aligned with the West, NATO, key US ally against the Soviet bloc, because it's was on the border of the Soviet Union. What's playing out in Turkey, this left-right violence, is happening in global context of left-right violence. And also parts of Europe as well. The cracking down on left-wing militants is something that is favoured by especially the US. And now when the coup happened, Jimmy Carter is president in the US and he's at a theatre show. He gets word that the military has taken over in Turkey and he gives tacit approval and goes back to watching the theatre calmly, apparently. The left hasn't won. The communists basically have lost when the military comes into power. This is our boys that have taken power.
That notional alignment of the military with the right more than the left is what's perceived from the outside, right?
Yeah, and eventually that's what eventuates as well with the state-centric philosophy, and that becomes the state philosophy and the constitutional philosophy as well. So you naturally align with the right.
And was there, and this is backtracking a little bit, but was there any, maybe not influence, but even obvious commentary from other nations, not necessarily Western nations, leading up to the coup?
I know that when the coup was undertaken and torture became well known, European countries were very critical, threatened Turkey with basically cutting off funding, investment in the country, and Turkey actually really needed, especially at that point. But the US actually stepped in and said, if we will fill the vacuum and with investment, if European countries decide to stop that because of the torture and the human rights abuses.
beacon of democracy there, the Americans.
Well, yes, they have. You know, I mean, look, that's another podcast series that we can get into.
But that's just a slap in the face of Western European leaders trying to, support democratic voices in Turkey.
Yeah.
Again, so many parallels to today's political environment. But the Europeans trying to, put some sort of restraint on the new leadership in Ankara. And the Americans just come, we'll support you regardless.
Yeah.
Because the context is also next door. Saddam Hussein is setting up his fascist dictatorship.
Yeah.
We have now the mullahs in charge
in Iran.
This all happened within the 12 months context.
Yeah. 1980. Yes, it was 79 was the Iranian Revolution. Yeah.
And Soviet Union invading Afghanistan. So the Americans were sort of distracted, trying to combat that. So maybe military coup in Turkey was probably one of the most favorable things that could happen to them.
Massively favorable. And, this is a coup that ultimately was against left-wing thought.
Americans have been proud to help Turkey in securing the democracy and its democracy and seeking prosperity. Our aspirations for our partnership remain large. Peace, security, and freedom for our peoples, close cooperation in securing these objectives, and success in defending them. I am confident that 40 years from now, Turks and Americans will look back and say that through their friendship, Turks and Americans secured for themselves the kind of world we have envisioned together. And now, please join me in a toast to President Evren, to the Turkish-American relationship, and to the friendship between our two peoples. And as you say in Turkish, Şeref eniz e.
We are coming to a close here at Putschcast.
Unfortunately.
What a topic, the Turkish military coup of 1980. We've learned about the violence that led up to it, the chaos. We've learned how a well-executed coup led to not much improvement when it came to prosperity, let alone civil liberties. But we've also learned what you've just mentioned again, that it really was about restraining those very liberal values of the original constitution that were very progressive, even by Western standards at the time. So turning back time really is what happened there. And military is famous for being conservative. And we also learned that this led to an oppression of religious beliefs. It led to an oppression of ethnic identity. Anything that wasn't pro-military state, secular government was outlawed, which then led to the Turkey we have today, which we will talk about another day because there's clear parallels and influence there. But maybe to close off, how is the Turkish coup of 1980 viewed today?
I would expect, given the way AKP, President Erdogan's party, and himself have weaponized the coup, Kemalism as a populist strategy, demonized it. I'm sure the way it's taught would be a critical perspective of the coup. Now, the people that lived through it will probably have a bit more of a nuanced view of it. That yes, it needed to happen, but subsequently, it's the outcomes from it were really bad. And what it did to Turkish society was really bad. Youth that haven't grown up in that area, I would think that they would have a very critical view of it. Yes, a coup, taking power by violent means is not good, but you also got to understand there's complexity around it too.
And this is what this podcast is about.
Yes.
So for the ones who don't understand, should listen back and get some context. But I do think it's very important to mention again that Kenan Evren, the leader of the coup, was sentenced in the nick of time just before he died under the Erdogan government, which I think speaks volumes as well to wait that long.
Yeah.
Because of course they should be held to account, but maybe not that way and in a more meaningful way. So
yeah, they have to understand. They did put it in the constitution that they could not be charged with anything post return back to politics. So they really did protect themselves.
Reminds me of certain events in the USA before the last election when people were pardoned before they were even charged with anything.
Yeah, so attempted coup in 2016, 15th July. soldiers could have learnt a lot from the 1980 coup and how to undertake a coup. So anyway, just leave it on light notes.
Teaser. What a teaser. I can't wait for that episode because we have the 10-year anniversary next year. And I'm sure we will talk about the 2016 failed coup, unlike the 1981, which was a successful coup. Please read up about it. Tell your friends about Putschcast as well, but also go and read Turkey's Political Leaders, Authoritarian Tendencies in a Democratic State by our very own Tezcan Gümüş.
Yes, definitely do. It's at Edinburgh University Press, and I look at every key leader from 1950 onwards and talk about the coups and the context that leading up to them and the reasons behind them. So everything that we discussed, detailed in that book as well.
Thank you also, David, for doing all this research and growing your moustache.
Just be careful.
Not a handlebar.
Not a handlebar. I've learned about moustaches and also learned that there's different names for different coups in Turkey, and I have to really read up on that. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, and it's been a fantastic, delightful conversation.
Putschcast. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram to find out about the latest coup coming your way.